Professeur Torrens, merci infiniment pour votre introduction très gentille. Après cet excellent sommaire, il n'est pas nécessaire de lire mon livre. Vous avez tous là-bas. Mais je suis très reconnaissante à la Fondation Latsis pour m'avoir invité et aussi à l'Université de Genève pour m'avoir invité et de participer en cette cérémonie des prix Latsis universitaires. Je voudrais féliciter tous les lauréats honorés aujourd'hui. Et maintenant, je voudrais, avec votre permission, changer en anglais pour mon discours. I really appreciate this opportunity to come to you and talk about European identity. You may think it is hubristic for an American and a non-European to talk about European identity, but I think that issue is central really to the future of liberal democracy as such. And as a result of the conflicts over multiculturalism, immigration, and integration, and then the crisis over Europe that we are living through the middle of, it seems to me that the question of identity is really central. I want to tell you a story just as a prelude. In May of 2004, I was in the Vatican at a conference of the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences. And May 1st, 2004 was when the European Union was expanded to include a number of Eastern European countries. And I was at a table with a German former head of the Bundesbank and a Polish former minister, both of whom were in their 70s. And as we were talking on this day that Poland was admitted into the EU, it turned out that the German bank president had served in the Wehrmacht, and the Polish minister had served in the Polish army during the war, in the Polish resistance. And I thought to myself, you know, what a amazing symbol of what the EU means for that generation of Europeans, that these two people are sitting at the same table in an academic conference at the moment that Poland has rejoined Europe after this long nightmare of living under communism. And so I very much appreciate the motives that led to the formation of the EU. But as I think we're all aware from reading the daily newspapers, the EU is now undergoing a life-threatening crisis over the euro. It is not simply a technical matter to be left up to financiers and to economists. In many ways, it is really a crisis over the identity of the EU and beyond that, of the identity of Europe and what obligations and responsibilities Europeans feel towards one another. But of course, the problem of identity is not one that exists only on a European level. It exists in every state in Europe as well. This is not a question. The question of national identity was one that I think Europeans hoped to be able to avoid in the decades after World War II. But as a result of immigration and the growth of cultural diversity and the rise of multiculturalism, it's an issue that everybody has had to confront. So in this talk, what I want to do first is to go over the history of the concept of identity, where it came from, and why it exists. And then I want to talk about the meaning of identity, both at the level of individual European societies and at the European level. And then to talk about some of the, I think, grave political issues that are raised by this question. So if you'll permit me, I want to go back and talk about where identity politics comes from. First thing to say about it is that it is a modern phenomenon. Identity, as we understand it, simply did not exist in medieval Europe. If you were a peasant growing up in the outskirts of Geneva or in Saxony or somewhere in the English Midlands in the year 1500, you did not worry about what your identity was, because your identity was completely ascribed to you by your surrounding society, meaning what your religion was, who you would marry, what your work would be, under whose sovereignty you fell. These were not decisions that any individual could take for himself or herself, and therefore the question, who am I really, never came up for people in this period. This began to change with the process of modernization. I would recommend very strongly the book by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, Sources of the Self, as one of the best introductions to the concept of identity. In many ways, Taylor argues that identity begins with the Protestant Reformation and with Martin Luther, because for the first time, Luther begins to argue that the essence of being a Christian believer is not acceptance of the rituals of the Catholic Church. It is what I believe on the inside, and I may conform to the rituals dictated by my society, but God is only looking inside my soul at whether or not I have faith. And this opens up the possibility that one's inside and one's outside are different, and that the authentic self is the self that dwells beneath all of the layers of social conformity. A secular version of this was, I think, put forward by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, citoyen de Genève, who in various of his writings, in the Promenade, or for example, or the Discourse on Inequality, argued that the authentic self was not the social self that was created by the passage of historical time, that social evolution distorted the true nature of human beings, that the true inner self was expressed in the sentiment de l'existence, that each one of us could feel on the inside that was different from what our surrounding societies told us we should be. Obviously, there are many other thinkers that had versions of this. Johann Gottfried Herder had a nationalist version that said the authentic self is actually a tribal or biological, communal reality. And I think the sociological reality of modernization, living in a competitive market economy, forces a distinction of the inside and the outside, because all of a sudden you have an economy that requires a carrière ouverte au talent. What one becomes in the course of one's career is not it's not the role that is assigned one by one's parents or by one's social situation. Social mobility is possible, and therefore the inner self is something that develops over time. So in many ways, the whole possibility of the inner self and identity being something different from the social conformity that we face living in society can only happen with the emergence of a mobile, competitive, pluralistic, modern society. Recognition is extremely important. It's not enough to say, who am I, as an inward question, unless other people intersubjectively recognize my identity and my dignity as I understand it, as a Ukrainian or as an African American. It doesn't count. And therefore, the search for identity and the struggle for identity is inherently a political act. This is a point that the philosopher Hegel understood well. His philosophy of history held that history itself is driven by the struggle for recognition, by the desire of human beings to have their fundamental dignity recognized by other human beings, and that modern democracy emerges when equal dignity, not the dignity of the master, but the mutual recognition of equal dignity is achieved. Now, in this context, you get phenomenon like modern nationalism. Nationalism is a form, it is a form of recognition and a form of identity, which is the one that is the most dominant in Europe over the last 200 years. Ernest Gellner, the great social anthropologist, I think, has written most intelligently on the phenomenon of nationalism, and he said, again, that like identity politics itself, it's a version of identity politics, but it is a modern phenomenon. In an agrarian society, people are bound by social class, by religion, by local ties to the manor lord. All of this begins to change with the rise of an industrial society. It needs a different kind of glue, and that glue typically is language and culture, because that's the common matrix in which people can communicate, exchange with one another, and live in a pluralistic, complex division of labor that characterizes the modern world. And I think we're all familiar with the nation-building exercises that took place in Europe over the past 500 years. French example is one to keep in mind. The creation of French nationality took several centuries to accomplish. The Capetian dynasty started as a small enterprise around the Île-de-France. It began to incorporate more and more territories that spoke different languages, that had very different customs, difference between the pays d'etat, pays d'élection. Ultimately, as a matter of political will, this was homogenized into the hexagonal country or territory that we recognize as modern France, with a common administration, a common language, common dialect. But all of this was the product of deliberate social creation. Now, the 20th century obviously saw tremendous excesses of nationalism, and the European project was obviously put in place by wise people in recognition that August of 1914 had really in some way spelled the end of European civilization, certainly the glorious European civilization of the 19th century, and that in many respects Europe could not survive after two horrific world wars unless, as Jürgen Habermas put it, Europeans moved into a post-national identity. And so in Europe, I think the discussion of national identity, and certainly the promotion of national identity at the level of individual countries, became a very politically incorrect subject. Germans were not encouraged to wave German flags at football matches and the like. But it also, I think, made inappropriate the idea of nation building itself on a pan-European level. And this is an issue that I think now comes back to haunt the European Union. We are familiar with the destructive impact of nationalism, this form of identity politics, the aggressive assertion of national identity and the domination of one nation by another. But national identity and nation building is absolutely critical for the success of any society. I spent a lot of time I have spent a lot of time in recent years looking at the problems of developing countries, very poor and fragmented countries, failed states, many of the poor states in sub-Saharan Africa. And in virtually every case, the central weakness that these countries have is the lack of national identity, the lack of a state, the lack of a common sense of purpose that allows governments to actually formulate and execute policies. Culture, is necessary. A shared culture is necessary as a medium of communication, as a way of getting individuals in inherently complex and diverse societies to communicate. And so you cannot have a modern successful society without some degree of nation building and national identity. Now, one of the phenomenon that's emerged in the last couple of generations is that the nationalism on a state level is not the only form of recognition around. We also have subnational identities, or we have the assertion of national identities in context of minorities in pluralistic societies, which is the origin of multiculturalism. Universal recognition of my dignity as a human being, which underlies liberal democracy, it turns out, is not enough for many people. People also want to be recognized as a Quebecois or as a Native American or as a gay person with equal dignity. And this has led to multicultural politics of the sort that we readily recognize all over the world today. Ethnic group recognition. In many respects, this was invented in Canada with the assertion of the community, the French-speaking community in Quebec, to status as a distinct society within the Canadian federal system, which was brought to a head in the vote on the Meech Lake Amendment to the federal charter, which would have established separate rules for the way that Quebec is governed differently from the rest of English-speaking Canada, which was a very large departure. This recognition of group rights in Quebec was a very important departure from the liberal principle that the liberal state recognizes not groups but only individuals. And I think every society that is de facto multicultural has been wrestling subsequently with the question of how to adequately recognize the demands made by ethnic and religious groups for special status as groups. In my country, in the United States, this has taken the form of demands for bilingualism among Hispanics, but also multilingualism in a school system like that of New York City. Well over 100 languages are taught in the school system. It has fueled controversies over affirmative action because the threat to dignity is always felt most intensely by groups that are excluded, that are marginalized, and rectifying those injustices becomes one of the driving forces of modern politics. So there's a lot of important theoretical issues that have been raised and discussed in the context of this multiculturalism debate. In a liberal, tolerant, pluralistic society, do we owe the protection of the state to individuals? Are rights held by individuals? Or can groups hold rights? This comes up in Europe, in particular, in cases where, for example, a Muslim family wants their daughter to marry somebody back in Morocco or Turkey, and the girl doesn't want to, and then goes to the state and says, I want to defend my right to make my own choice in life. And this is an issue that European courts have wrestled with. In my view, there's no way to interpret our whole tradition of modern liberalism if you do not take the side of the girl against the family. But that is not the way that every court in Europe has actually interpreted the rights. Some have actually upheld the rights of the family because of a deference to the cultural practices of the particular group involved. And so this is, in many respects, a still unresolved and very neuralgic issue. Now, obviously, this was not a terribly great subject. The question of national identity was not a great subject of discussion in Europe until really the past decade, when the question of immigration, and particularly immigration by people from Muslim countries, began to appear as an important political issue. And it became particularly acute after September 11th, after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, and then the other attacks that occurred in Spain, in Britain, many attempted attacks in other parts of the world, which raised the possibility of radical Islamist groups going after the very foundations of democratic societies. And I think it's worthwhile thinking a little bit about what that religious challenge represents. And I believe that modern Islamism, in many of its manifestations, actually should not be interpreted as a form of religiosity. If by religion one means that people are suddenly converted to a belief in God and to a religiously inspired or an inner conversion, I think that, in fact, the phenomenon of the rise of Islamism is better understood as a species of identity politics, much like nationalism is a form of identity politics. This is an argument that's been made by a number of people other than myself. Olivier Waugh, the French scholar of Muslim affairs, is probably the most prominent advocate of this kind of an interpretation. And he argues something like the following, that traditional religiosity in Muslim countries is actually very particularistic. That is to say, your religious identity is ascribed to you. It is not something that is freely chosen. It is the product of your local mosque and family and environment. You have really no choice in your choice of religion. What begins to happen, though, with urbanization in Muslim countries, and particularly with immigration by people from that part of the world to non-Muslim countries, is what Olivier Waugh calls the deterritorialization of Islam. And particularly for Muslim immigrants or their children living in non-Muslim countries, the question of identity comes to haunt them in a particularly acute way. For now they are not living in a society that ascribes a very specific role to religion, that defines their social role, that tells them who they can marry and how they need to behave. And it is for that reason that you have what Emil Durkheim called the phenomenon of alienation or normlessness, that you've lost contact with the society and its norms that governed life, the life of your parents or your grandparents, and all of a sudden you're put into a new situation in which you may not know what is haram or halal because there's never been a precedent for it back in Morocco or in Pakistan. And this is the context, I think, in which radical Islamism fills a certain vacuum because Al-Qaeda and other Salafist preachers can pose an answer to the question, who am I? They can tell people in this situation, in immigrant communities, well, you're not a traditional Muslim. You're not practicing the Islam of your forefathers, nor are you accepted by the society into which you have immigrated. What your real identity is with a much purer and more universal form of Islam. You are a member of an enormous ummah or community that stretches all the way from Tangier to Indonesia. That is who you are. It is a much purer and more abstract form of, and much more scriptural form of Islam that has tremendous appeal, and it has tremendous appeal particularly to second and third generation children of immigrants who no longer are rooted in the localized Sufism or saint worship that characterized the religiosity of their parents, but do not feel accepted by the European societies where they had been living. And this is why Olivier Waugh describes this in a way as the, the Protestantization of Islam, because for this group of people, Islam is no longer a social norm imposed by the outside society. It is something that one believes on the inside, when the rest of the secular society around them does a lot of forbidden things. It is really the internal belief that makes one a Muslim. And this is why I think recruitment has been particularly strong in second generation, among second generation Muslims in Europe. All right, now let me then move on to the question of European identity and why this has posed a particular problem for Europeans of this generation. So as I said, European identity is problematic because the whole European project was founded on a kind of anti-national identity basis. It was intended to get beyond the national selfishness and antagonisms that characterized 20th century European politics. And therefore, there was a belief that there would be a new universal European identity that would supplant the old identities of being Italian or German or French or whatever. But it was the case that these old identities never disappeared, even though politically they were not something that anyone spent much time talking about. And particularly on a popular level, I don't think that any citizen of a European country in the intervening decades ever forgot that they were indeed Dutch or German or Danish or Swiss or whatever. And this became a problem, really, the ghosts of these old identities really became a problem with the influx of immigrants and with the growth of immigrant communities that did not necessarily share those values. Now, what was the reaction and what have been the kinds of responses to, in a sense, the need for identity? Because I think what the violent terrorism did was suggest all of a sudden to people that there are those in our community that do not share the basic values that we have grown up with, that are fundamentally hostile and willing to use violence in order to undermine that sense of community. And therefore, the question of identity and the question of national identity, what is it that you owe to the community that you live in, comes to the fore. And I think that there's in fact been a tremendous variation in European responses with very different impacts on the degree of integration and the success in creating a national identity across different countries in Europe. Let me just give you the examples, these different examples of France, Germany, Holland, and Britain. French national identity, in a sense, is the least problematic because there is a republican tradition coming out of the revolution, a tradition that is laïque, that treats citizens equally. And in many respects, the French concept is, I think, the only viable one for a modern society that grounds citizenship not in ethnicity or race or religion, but in abstract political values to which people from different cultures can adhere. In the French context, it's also very much built around French language. I've always found it very impressive that Léopold Senghor, the Senegalese poet, was admitted to the Académie Française back in the 1940s. And it was an important symbol of the way I think the French see their identity, that if you spoke French and if you could write beautiful poetry in French, that qualified you for the Académie Française. That was enough, in a sense, to bind you to that community. And therefore, that republican sense of identity has underlaid French citizenship. A lot of people pointed to the riots that occurred in the French banlieue back in the mid-2000s as evidence of alienation and some would say an Islamist threat that existed in France itself. And I think that this is a complete misunderstanding of what happened in that country. There was an Islamist threat coming out of Algeria in the early 1990s that was largely dismantled by the French intelligence service. What was going on in the French banlieue was very different. These were people that did not reject French identity. They, in fact, believed in the goals that French society set for them. It's just that they were prevented from getting there. They couldn't get jobs. They were barred by racism from access to opportunities that white French people had, and that was the source of their unhappiness. And so it was in many ways much more comparable to African Americans rioting in American inner cities, as has happened on numerous occasions in recent American history. And by the way, I think of all European countries, in many ways, the French are the closest to the United States in having a set of political values be at the core of identity. And I think both of those examples, show the way towards what that would mean in a broader European context. If you take another case that's very different, it's that of Germany. Germany had an evolution of its sense of identity that was completely different from France, partly due to the fact that the Germans were scattered all over Central and Eastern Europe, and in the process of German unification, they had to define Germanness in ethnic terms. And so legally, their citizenship law was based on a jus sanguinis. That is to say, you could become a citizen if you had a German mother, and not on a jus soli, meaning you're a citizen automatically if you're born in the territory of the sovereign. And up until the year 2000, that meant that if you were a German, an ethnic German coming from Russia, say, and spoke no German, you could get citizenship far more easily than if you were a second or third generation Turk who had grown up in Germany, spoke perfect German, and spoke no Turkish at all. The Germans have begun to change that practice, but the cultural meaning of saying, I am German, is very different from the cultural meaning of saying that I am French, because it does have it has a connotation that is more deeply rooted in blood, and it means that when Angela Merkel says that multiculturalism has failed in Germany, I think she's only half right, or she would be quite wrong to ascribe that failure simply to an unwillingness of Muslim immigrants and their children in Germany to want to assimilate, because I think that a lot of the failure of integration or assimilation comes as much from the side of German society as it does from those immigrant communities. Then we get to two other, I think, problematic cases, Holland and Britain. In Holland, national identity has always been defined by the Verzweeling principle, the pillarization of Dutch society into a Protestant, a Catholic, and a socialist pillar. The Dutch are famously tolerant, but it's a strange kind of tolerance. They tolerate people as long as they do their thing over there and not in my community. And in a certain sense, it was a natural thing for the Muslims to start arriving in the Netherlands and to create their own pillars, since all the other religious confessions had their own pillars traditionally. And that led to the emergence of so-called black schools, in which you had only Muslim students with no opportunity to meet native Dutch people, and I think has been one of the important obstacles in promoting faster or greater integration of those immigrants into Dutch society. I would put at the last of the list is Britain, this was probably the European country or the Western country that went in for multiculturalism the most wholeheartedly, and multiculturalism in the sense that I think is the wrong understanding of modern liberalism. That is to say, in Britain, there was a belief that pluralism meant that you had to respect the autonomy of individual immigrant communities, and that the government had no role in actively trying to integrate them into a broader British culture. I have a colleague, Robert Lycan, who has written a book called Europe's Angry Muslims that will be published in the United States very shortly, that gives some fascinating statistics that in terms of the number of minority members recruited into extremist organizations, and in terms of the number of attempted violent acts by members of this community on a per capita basis, Britain by far has the highest rate, much higher than in France or in Holland or in Germany. And I think part of the reason for that was the British approach to multiculturalism that simply let radical imams preach in their local communities without any interference from the authorities and without any effort by the state to actively use the education system to produce people that had the same, French-style basic allegiance to the British state. And again, the British have, changed these policies in the last few years in light of the London subway bombings and other terrorist acts, but it still is a much more problematic relationship between that country and its immigrant communities. Now, if we look across these different examples, which of them is the most successful, I think, as you can tell, I actually think the French have been the most successful. It's a little bit hard to judge these things because it also depends on the size, the absolute size of the immigrant communities. But I do think for many reasons that the political identity, the neutral, Republican, liberal political identity that France has promoted is really, the model that needs to be followed by other countries. Bassam Tibi, who is a scholar at Göttingen University, is the inventor of the term Leitkultur, which was then used by the Christian Democrats in Germany as a definition of what they wanted immigrants to assimilate to. Leitkultur, I think, was misused, but he has a very similar idea in the back of his head to French republicanism. And I think by contrast, the Dutch and the English or the British, in a way, have had the worst experience because, in a sense, they've not addressed the question of national identity at all, and they've not tried to identify a political form of identity that would accommodate people with very different religious and cultural backgrounds. Now, let me turn to nation building at the EU level. So the next important question is, when we pass from the level of these individual European states to the question of European identity as such, what is it? And what kind of deficit do we have? And I think everybody who's been going through this crisis that we're in the middle of the euro realizes now in retrospect that there are many flaws in the Maastricht Treaty and in the whole process of creating the euro. The absence of a disciplining mechanism, the absence of an exit mechanism out of either the euro or the EU itself. A lot of this discussion is dominated by people in finance and by economists because that's the short-term problem that faces us, really a new recession and a collapse of the European banking system as a result of Europe's failure to address politically these kinds of problems. And I don't want to minimize the importance of this at all, but I would point out that in a sense there is a deeper failure at the European level, and it is a failure basically of identity. That is to say, there was never a successful attempt to create a European sense of identity and a European sense of citizenship that would define obligations and responsibilities and duties and rights that Europeans had to one another beyond the simple wording of the different treaties that were signed. The EU, in many respects, was treated as a technocratic exercise done for purposes of economic efficiency. And I think what we see now is that post-national values are not enough to really bind this community together. So the Germans feel that they've got a sense of, let's say wealthy Germans feel a sense of noblesse oblige towards poorer Germans. They feel a sense of social solidarity, which is the basis of the German welfare state, but they do not feel similar obligations to the Greeks, whom they regard as spendthrift and poorly disciplined and very un-German in their general approach to fiscal matters, and therefore they feel no obligation to take care of them. And so there's no solidarity in that broader European sense. I think for various reasons, Europe may finally stumble onto a short-term solution to this crisis, but I do not think that any form of deepening at this point is a viable project unless someone pays more attention and is able to answer the question in a more substantive sense of what it means to be a European, not just in the negative sense that we don't want conflict and we don't want old nationalism and war, but what it means in terms of positive values. Now, let me just conclude by saying that all of these two issues that I've discussed, immigration and national level identity and European level identity, in the next few years, I think, are going to merge as really the same issue because these are both the central issues for all of the new populist parties that have arisen all over the continent of Europe. That is to say, opposition to immigration and Euroscepticism. We now, we have these older parties like the Front National in France or the National Front in Britain, but in the last decade we've seen the emergence of quite a few new ones. Geert Wilders' Party of Freedom in the Netherlands, the Danish People's Party, the Sweden Democrats, the True Finn Party, of course the SVP here in Switzerland. And I think that the common opposition to both Europe and to immigration stems from a common source among all of these parties. It is basically a populist impulse. It is a feeling that the needs of ordinary citizens have been ignored by elites with regard both to the deepening of the European Union and with regard to immigration issues. In France, many people that voted for the National Front were extremely resentful of the fact that, for example, living in Marseille, there was a lot of crime, and the state was not willing to deal with that problem forthrightly because the crime was associated with, Muslim gangs and so forth. You can replicate this story in many other European settings. The mainstream parties were too politically correct to recognize that these were issues, and as a result, these populist parties then had to take matters into their own hands and to organize. And to be quite honest with you, the whole European project, in fact, has been a very elite-driven affair. We know of several occasions in which the issue of agreeing to a treaty was put up for popular referendum, and when the people gave the wrong answer, the elite said, well, the people were wrong about that, and we're going to have to vote again. And so I think that, in a sense, the rise of this kind of populism actually reflects, in a certain way, a deepening of democracy in Europe, that European publics are not going to be led along by their elites as they were in the first few decades after the Second World War, but it means that there are tremendous dangers for European democracy that lie ahead in the immediate future. I think we all recognize the EU is at an important crossroads. It either deepens or it begins to split apart. The current middle ground is really not one that's sustainable. And I would just leave you with the following thought, that the deepening project, that is to say, moving simply from monetary union to fiscal union, you may argue at great length about what sense this makes in economic terms. I think we all recognize that. But this is going to have a tremendous number of political costs that need also to be taken into account. there is, in the first place, absolutely no grassroots support in Europe for this deepening project. This is, again, going to be very much an elite-driven project undertaken for largely technical reasons. It is actually something that's stimulating, in a way, the renationalization of Europe. And so already people have said that fiscal union is, in effect, a Germanization of Europe. And it also forces conditions that amount to the suspension of democracy. So now you have technocrats running the governments of Italy and Greece. They were not elected in the normal fashion by their constituents, and the reason that they're there is that they answer to the conditions set not by the Italian or the Greek public, but set by other parts of Europe. And I think that this kind of deepening on the part of both the northern countries and the southern ones is going to lead to choices that will be politically unpalatable to both of them. And all of this is being undertaken against the background of a prolonged and likely deepening economic crisis. So I think in many respects this identity problem is one that we all need to think about very deeply. It's one that will come back, I guarantee you, in our politics in the near future. Since the title of my talk was Identité, européenne, I didn't speak about the United States, but we have many of the same kinds of problems, although I think our form of national identity is actually quite accommodating of immigration. We also have a populist backlash against immigration in a sense that our national identity is under threat. And so there's no democracy, I think, in the world that is exempt from having to face forthrightly this set of issues. So again, thank you very much for your attention here today. And time for questions.
Professor Fukuyama, I would like to thank you on behalf of the audience for enlightening us. I would be glad, of course, to hear you answer questions, and we will have questions. You've talked about European identity. You alluded to the identity in the United States. You didn't talk about Swiss identity. Is there do you have a short answer to Swiss identities?
Yeah, actually, this came up at the press conference I had this afternoon where one of the participants said, well, you know, the French have a clear national identity, but look at us Swiss, we've got 3 languages and, you know, all this diversity. And I think that's completely wrong, because I think actually there is a very distinct Swiss identity that spans all of the different linguistic groups. Identity does not have to be based on language. And it makes the Swiss very different from Germans and French and Italians and all of their different neighbors. You know, in many respects, although identity in the modern world had a religious root, that a lot of these traditions have become ritualized. And so what it means to be a European of a particular national group means to follow certain cultural practices. Let's say Christmas. I spent a lot of time as a visiting professor in Denmark, and it turns out if you don't eat the kippers and herring and the different dumplings in a certain precise order, they know that you're not Danish, and it's a great source of embarrassment to people that are outside that community because they don't understand those rituals. And so I won't try to define, you know, it probably has something to do with watchmaking and you know, precision machinery. I won't try to define what Swiss identity is, but there's no question that in that sense, it's a very strong one.
Thank you very much. If you want to come for a sabbatical, you can come and study
All
this
right.
here. S'il y a des questions, je pense que M. Fukuyama les prendra aussi bien en anglais qu'en français. N'hésitez pas, et il y a des microphones.
Thank you. Professor, there are three, in a way, options that immigrants have and governments of countries. It is assimilation, which certainly was the case in a way in the United States, melting pot idea. The second is isolation, which is really creation of ghettos. You mentioned UK, that probably comes close to that. And the third is integration, whereby people do keep some of their cultural heritage, even the language, etc., but they really are normal parts of the economic, even political life of the country. And you had mentioned Canada, for example, and Canada has gone through this evolution, being really Anglo-dominated, and then becoming a bilingual country, and then going to a multicultural country, right, which is now, by the way, also in danger. But that is an example, actually, of integration, precisely through that mechanism. Would you have a comment on that?
No, I think people make that distinction between integration and assimilation. I actually think that assimilation almost never happens, that people, tend to keep their cultural and ethnic identities. That's certainly the case in the United States. And between the two of them, for political purposes, I don't think it matters all that much which one of them it is. The main question is, are you willing, as part of your identity, and all of us have multiple identities in a modern society. We're not just one thing. We're not just Swiss, or we're not just Catholic, or whatever. We have multiple identities. And the critical issue is, do you identify with the national purposes and the national community of the society in which you're living? And whether you've been assimilated or integrated, it doesn't matter if you can answer that question positively. And I think the reason that people are worried about this issue is that, there are a very small minority of individuals that are living in these isolated ghettos and do not, see the larger community as something that they are members of.
C'est allumé? Oui. No, I just want to point out that there is a place where European identity functions very well, exists. I mean, actually, national identities almost disappear. It is CERN, the European Center for Nuclear Research, which is here in Geneva. I mean, when you go to CERN, you cannot know whether you are French or German or Greek or British. I mean, it is extremely successful.
Professor, I had a question related to your part on nationalism, related to the Basque nationalism in Spain. You mentioned about this identity concept of nationalism at the beginning, and I believe that the Basque nationalism, it's partly due to the weakness of the liberal democratic state in Spain in the last 30 years, which created, through academia and some political interest, a concept that included even terrorism for the last 30 years. And tell you the truth, I think that it's not positive and even true. And I was wondering whether you agree that some concept of identities and nationalisms are really used and not represent the reality, but yes, rather a small party interest.
Oh, of course. I think that if you ask why nationalism and religion continue to be such big forces in modern politics, when many people had hoped that the world would actually look like CERN and everybody would be cosmopolitan and get along with one another, I think the simple answer to that is that both of them are terrific mobilizational tools, that you can get people excited and into the streets or joining your organization or voting for you as a politician, because the emotional pull of identity politics is much stronger, for example, than the pull of class politics. This is something the Marxists got completely wrong. They thought that workers, just because of their economic status, would show a natural affinity towards each other. And it turns out, no, that's not true, that it is much more nation and religion that still continue to attract people. And so it's absolutely the case that, there's no nationalist group in the world that doesn't reflect the ambitions and, the energies of the people that are using that, for a particular political end. So it's not, it's an entirely socially constructed phenomenon. It's not by any means natural way for people to organize themselves.
Professeur, je voulais vous demander si à propos d'identité, on ne peut pas parler de minorities, sans parler des exemples des aborigènes australiens ou comment les États-Unis ont traité leurs Amérindiens. Je voulais vous demander qu'est-ce qu'il faut. Il n'y aurait pas une identité à deux vitesses. Il y a ceux qui ont plus ou moins réussi, peut-être comme les Basques un peu, mais il y a ceux dont on s'en fiche complètement, par exemple les Lapons ou bien les Sams, donc du nord de l'Europe, mais par exemple les Arméniens, est-ce que c'est une minorité, mais c'est une véritable identité. Et puis par exemple les Roms, les Tziganes, on s'en fiche complètement. Donc y a-t-il des identités de première classe et d'autres de deuxième classe, ceux qui n'ont pas triomphé, qui n'étaient pas dans l'Austro-Hongrie? Merci.
I think that what you say is correct. That many identities are in fact simply destroyed or overcome, because the dominant group is simply stronger. Today, we don't, politically support that, but in fact, and this is one of the unpleasant realities of modern democracy, that all modern democracies are the beneficiaries of violence and authoritarian politics that simply took place in a nation-building process that happened before democracy arrived. So, for example, in that example I gave in France, Breton or language in Burgundy. I mean, there are a lot of things that were snuffed out that could have been the core of actual nations in a different kind of world. But in the course of French nation building, they're all homogenized into a single entity. And tragically, for a lot of these indigenous peoples, they were not well organized and didn't have the numbers and were wiped out by disease. And that's why it's only in the context of a pretty tolerant, liberal democracy that they can gently start reasserting those identities and hope to get, some kind of compensation or recognition. But it's certainly the case that it's an uphill struggle for them.
Professor Fukuyama, you said that there was a failure of creating a European identity at the European level. But for you, what are the characteristics, this sense of being European? I would be very interested to hear about this topic.
Well, as I said, I think that any identity for a modern democracy really depends on allegiance to a set of political principles. So since those principles in Europe are built around, well, okay, and just to give you an example of that, so what is American national identity? American national identity is allegiance to the U.S. Constitution, to its laws, to the principle of democracy, to the Bill of Rights, right? This whole set of founding documents that define the political community that Americans belong to. And so if you think about this analogously, it's difficult for Europe because Europe isn't a nation. It isn't, it does have a constitution that's way too long and, complex, but it coexists with, political loyalties to subunits. But I think that if you're conceiving of this project, you really have to focus on a central set of principles, rights and duties, and then you teach that, to every school child throughout Europe as part of their civic education, that they have this duty, to this entity called Europe. And obviously, as long as Europe is weak and, squabbling internally, that becomes something that's very hard to do. But I think that's that's kind of the nature of the project that I had in mind.
I will take 4 more questions. I'm sorry. We have one over there.
Merci beaucoup, M. Fukuyama. Je suis sénégalais, je vis en Suisse depuis 12 ans et je suis journaliste correspondant aux Nations Unies. J'ai une question concernant la France. Vous avez donné le modèle français comme étant un exemple que l'Europe pourrait suivre pour construire des identités, ou bien une identité européenne. Mais la question, elle est simple. Ne pensez-vous pas qu'aujourd'hui, la surenchère politique à laquelle nous assistons en France est de nature à détruire le génie humain et intellectuel qui a permis à un Nicolas Sarkozy de devenir président dans un grand pays qui s'appelle la France? Je vous remercie.
Well, so one of the things that's been taking place in response to the rise of these far-right populist parties is that mainstream politicians have been stealing part of their agenda as a means of undercutting their appeal. And I think Sarkozy was one of the first European politicians to figure this out. And he started this when he was justice minister under Chirac. And he made crime a big issue, and he was very actually inconsistent, because at the same time he was, criticizing the Muslim community, he was also trying to organize them, and when he became president, appointed, several non-European ministers and so forth. But he has had a little bit of trouble resisting this demagogic temptation to use that issue, to advance his own standing. And I'm afraid that other center-right politicians have been indulging in the same thing. So Angela Merkel has done this, and David Cameron has done this. If it's managed correctly, I think it's okay, because better these guys than the far-right parties. Better Sarkozy than the Front National. But all of that being said, I think that there, as you suggest, there are a lot of dangers in going down that road.
Thank you very much. Perhaps it was the 2 little red S's in your title that threw me a little bit, and I was looking forward to hearing about a larger Europe and those identities that are on the fringes of the organized Europe, which very rightly, obviously, you focused on. But could you please give us a little bit of your wisdom about the rest of the non-organized Europe into the EU? Not the EU part, but the other
the ones that are not members.
That are not members. What is it to be a European? Does it take, to be part of the EU? And how does that correlate? Because part of the problem is the immigration is being fed not only from outside of Europe, but also from inside.
Right.
So how do you correlate the non-organized and the organized Europe? Thank you.
Well, I certainly don't think that membership in the EU, has been an important, although I answered this question saying that, it's the potential basis for building an identity, I don't think that that's really happened. And I think that the, non-member EU countries have faced, very similar kinds of problems in defining, what they are, whether it's based on ethnicity or religion or something of the sort. I'm not quite sure of the import of your question, whether it's more a normative one or a descriptive one. I mean, in normative terms, I think everybody, whether they're members of the EU or not, has basically got the same problem, that they are de facto diverse, and they've got to create more open types of identities. But perhaps you're alluding to the fact that even within Europe you have significant differences in culture, which itself creates problems.
Well, I'm alluding to
Yeah. All the Polish plumbers, right. Yeah, okay, so, right, so right, yeah, I mean, I think that's in general true, that since there wasn't a nation-building project that accompanied the expansion of Europe, as it gets bigger, it gets even more incoherent. I think that's without question.
Okay, Professor Fukuyama. Well, okay, we'll be quite short. So we might cross the Mediterranean towards south, and about a year ago, when the the appraisal started in Arab countries, we thought it was search for democracy against dictatorship and corruption. Now, when we see when some democratic elections take place, the Islamists, they tend to win in all those countries. So if in 1950s, let's say, the Arab nationalism was against the former colonial regimes and by Nasser and to build military force, we believe that now it's going to go through, Sharia law, more Islamism, and what is it dangerous and what does it signify for us?
It's potentially dangerous, but there are many forms of Islamism, and you have two big models out there, Turkey and Iran, one of which is a dictatorship and the other of which is a fairly successful, rapidly growing democracy. And I would not, and everybody worries about the bad kind, the more radical kind coming to power, but it's not clear that that's going to be the model that will prevail in Tunisia or Egypt or Libya. But there's no question that religion, in that part of the world remains the most powerful mobilizational tool in politics, and so therefore it will have, it will be part of the democratic, landscape in the Middle East.
I'm a geneticist, so I will ask you an obvious question. Is the social and cultural identity genetic or environmental? And is there any evolutionary advantage or disadvantage to have an identity?
I actually talk about this in my new book because I got a chapter on the biological origins of political institutions. And what I would say is that the faculty for acquiring identity, meaning following norms established by the community that you are in, is genetically based, but the content of those norms is completely cultural, just like language. So the facility for acquiring language is genetically programmed, but the actual language you speak is cultural.
I will give the opportunity for the last question to one of our laureates, Dominique Egel. After all, you deserve to be able to ask the last question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Fukuyama, for your very inspiring talk. Being here in Geneva, we like to challenge our French neighbors. That's why I would like to challenge one of your points about the French Republican model being the solution, maybe for liberal democracy, even on a European level. It seems to me that the French Republican model is a kind of political religion where people are told the way they can be free.
Yeah.
It's a positive form of liberty. It's not a negative form of liberty with which liberalism is usually associated. After the French Revolution, when Robespierre came in charge, he invented a supreme being to give a political religion to his democracy.
Yeah.
So do you really believe this is the best way to define liberal democracy?
I meant best in a relative sense. So I think of the European options that I see out there, it comes closest to what I would argue needs to be done. But you're right that, for example, with regard to religion, French republicanism isn't just laïque, it's anti-clerical, in its core, and that just doesn't work in the modern world. You cannot force people to give up, their religious affiliations, and so I would modify that model in quite a number of senses. But what I do think is the core of that is that, it is built around democratic political values based on the active assertion of those values by the state. And I think that that's kind of what I meant by saying that that's the necessary model that needs to be followed. You can change it for specific circumstances. The American version of that is not just not anti-clerical, it's actually positively in favor of religion. And that's another alternative.
Mesdames et messieurs, j'espère que vous n'en voudrez pas de ne pas prendre encore les nombreuses questions nombreuses mains qui se levaient. Je vous remercie d'avoir été avec nous ce soir. Je remercie évidemment le professeur Fukuyama.